Hello and welcome back. Today's lecture is going to be on the Adams administration. The Washington administration is done. George Washington decided that he was only going to run for 2 terms, right? He was afraid that if he ran any longer than that, it would start to become an imperial presidency. And he didn't want autocratic rule in America. So he decides to step down. And when he steps down, his natural successor is going to be John Adams, his vice president. Adams is a Federalist. Now, Washington had said he wasn't a Federalist, but in reality, he was. He was, in favor of a strong national government, and so is Adams. And so, when Washington leaves, he gives a farewell address that's really famous. That farewell address warned against three big things. One is sectionalism. He said, don't let the country divide itself based on East and West, North and South. We need to come together and unite as one country. Two, he warns against political factions or political parties. Don't divide yourselves based on, Federalists or Democratic Republicans. And the third thing he's going to warn about is, foreign entanglements. He said, we need to we're a new nation. We're relatively weak. We need to mind our own business and don't get caught up in European affairs. What we're going to see is that we're not going to be able to avoid those three things. Particularly the foreign entanglements and political factions are going to become very apparent during the Adams administration. And then later, sectionalism becomes very important as slavery becomes more and more of an issue. So, and Washington was pretty prescient about interpreting the threats that the future holds. So Adams takes over, and one of the first things that he has to deal with is Jay's Treaty from Washington's administration, right? The British had a bunch of forts in American territory or just outside of American territory that threatened America. They were impressing our sailors or kidnapping our American sailors and forcing them to fight for the British. We wanted to stop that. It looked like America and England were about to go to war. Washington sent the Supreme Court Justice John Jay over to Great Britain to negotiate, and we essentially were able to come up with a peace treaty with the British. Well, that upset the French because the French were at war with the British, and the French really thought that we were going to side with the French against the British. And they had good reason to believe that because the French helped us during our war for independence against the British. And so, they helped us, they expect us to help them. But then we signed this peace treaty, Jay's Treaty with the British. And so now the French are upset. And all of a sudden now it's looking like we're heading to war with the French. They're attacking our ships out on the sea. And it's really becoming this kind of dangerous situation. So Adams is going to send people to Paris to negotiate with the French to see if we can come up with some sort of diplomatic solution. And this will lead to an event that's going to be referred to as the XYZ affair. And so the American representatives go to Paris and they're trying to talk with the French government, the French foreign secretary, the people who deal with foreign countries to come up with some sort of treaty. And when they get to Paris, they go to their hotel room and they wait for French representatives to come get them to negotiate. Well, they're waiting and they're waiting and they're waiting and they're waiting. Nobody shows up. And then eventually some French agents show up. They get the nicknames X, Y, and Z. And so these French agents show up and they demand a bribe from America before the French government will even sit down and negotiate. And the bribe is pretty substantial. It's $250,000 in cash right now, and then a $10 million loan to the French government so they can use that to fight the British or whatever. And this is going to take Americans by surprise. We're a democracy. And so in our democracy, we have like this real strong belief that the government's there to serve us, that, paying bribes is just government corruption that feels wrong, even though it is happening in America too, but not kind of this official or to this scale. But we have a bad taste in our mouths with this. Plus, we are very concerned that it makes us look weak, right? If we pay this bribe, then we're in modern parlance punks, right? And we don't want to. That's a bad look, and so we don't want to be. We don't want to be in that position. And so the American diplomats, what they do is they write back to American newspapers to explain what's happening. And that's why these French agents get the names X, Y, and Z, because you got to be really careful. You don't want to upset the French government too much in a situation like this. And so X, Y, and Z, demand this bribe. And once it gets back to the American people, this is just, it's going to outrage the Americans. Now, in Europe, this kind of behavior is kind of normal. The French are just like, what's the big deal, right? You want this, you got to grease the wheels to get things done, and this will do that. So, they don't think it's that big of a deal. But, like I said, this is not, accepted behavior in America. And so, the XYZ affair is going to really upset Americans. We are going to refuse to pay the bribe. As a matter of fact, there's this popular opinion that's circulating around, and the catchphrase becomes millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. And what that means is we're not going to give you one single penny for a bribe, but we will literally spend millions of dollars on our military to defend ourselves if it comes to war, right? It's bribe us or we're going to war. Well, we're not going to give you a penny to avoid war. We would rather spend all of our money on our military and defend ourselves that way, because one, we're not punks that way. And two, if the French push us around, then the British will push us around, and then who knows what's next. And so the idea is we're going to have to stand up for ourselves at some point, so we might as well do it here. And so what ends up happening is we essentially end up having an undeclared war on the seas. And so America, we're in our infancy. We don't have a very strong military yet, and so this is a tough deal. And so, because of this, Adams is going to recognize that he's got to act to be able to defend America, and he's a Federalist, so he believes in a strong national government, and so he really thinks the national government should be the one taking the reins here, and he's going to push through a bunch of Federalist programs. Some of these kind of make sense, right? The French are attacking us. We should probably have a stronger Navy to defend that, and so he's going to push that through. He's going to push through a program for higher taxes, because if we're going to have a Navy, we have to pay for it, right? And so, more taxes, which will be tariffs and excise taxes. We don't have an income tax yet. So, I know when I said taxes, everybody just thought, oh, income tax. No, that's not till the Progressive era, much later on. So, higher taxes, larger army, larger Navy. But then there's something else that Adams is also concerned about. He's concerned about infiltration of European French immigrants into the United States that are going to sabotage America. And so that is going to lead him to pass something that's very controversial, which will be called the Alien and Sedition Acts. I know we like to believe that America, we're this nation of immigrants, and that's true. We have embraced immigration in a way that very few countries historically have. We are a melting pot of lots of different races, religions, national identities. But it's always been kind of controversial. And so, you can see it. This is our second president, and already we're having problems with immigration. And Adams is really concerned about it. And so part of the Alien and Sedition Act is going to allow him to round up immigrants that haven't naturalized yet, round them up and ship them back over seas, essentially kicking out immigrants. The other thing he's afraid of, it's not just immigrants, he's afraid of criticism at home. He feels like he needs America to be united behind this undeclared war against the French. And so any criticism will just hinder that effort. And so he wants to silence his critics. And so the alien part of the Alien and Sedition Acts is going to deport aliens. The sedition part is going to essentially silence any of his critics. They're going to arrest people that criticize the government. They're going to, take away the newspapers that are publishing critical things. Those are mostly newspapers run by Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, and so he uses it to round up his political rivals, and so that ends up being wildly controversial. One of those policies he pushes through for review: larger army, larger navy, higher taxes to pay for that, and the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, the Alien and Sedition Acts is, definitely the most controversial part of this program. He's imprisoning and deporting citizens of other countries. Those are the aliens. Now, how constitutional is that? Well, it depends. There has to be some due process there. If this is going to happen, this isn't the only time America has done something like this within our history, and so depending on how it's done, it can be constitutional. But the part that's really going to cause an uproar is the part that silenced the critics. It's the sedition part. When he starts to, we're a democracy. And for democracy to work, we have to have freedom of speech and freedom of the press, which means we have to criticize our government, right? And so anytime the government says, no, you can't criticize me, that's anti-democratic. Right. And so particularly the Jefferson's Republicans are going to be, because they're the ones that are going to jail. They're the ones that are losing their newspapers. They're going to be outraged by this. And so they're going to try and figure out a way to stop it. Well, what we know today is the sedition part of this is definitely unconstitutional. The Alien and Sedition Acts are unconstitutional. And today we all know that if a law that gets passed is unconstitutional, then you take it to the court system, and the court system will determine whether it's constitutional or not. And if it is, strike down that law. Well, where in the Constitution does it say that the courts can do that? I'll give you a minute to look it up. Yeah, nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the courts can declare law unconstitutional. We actually make that up in the court case, Marbury versus Madison. Well, that case hasn't happened yet. That's not going to happen until the Jefferson administration. So nobody knows how to declare a law unconstitutional. And since the Federalists control the presidency and they control Congress, they pass whatever laws they want and just say, you got to live with it. And there's no real way to declare them unconstitutional. So all of a sudden now Republicans are scrambling to figure out a way to get this law declared null and void. And that is going to lead to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Remember, Jefferson's Democratic Republicans believe that the ultimate power doesn't lie with the national government, who just passed this terrible law. It belongs to the state governments, because the state governments are closer to the people. Right? They're the more democratic part of our government. And so he thinks, well, okay, if the state governments are more powerful, it makes sense, because it's the state governments that sent delegates to write the Constitution. It's the state governments that ratified the Constitution. So if the federal government does something that's unconstitutional, it makes sense that the states should be the ones to say, nope, you can't do that. That's not constitutional. So the Republicans in Virginia and Kentucky essentially believe that these acts are unconstitutional and decide to weigh in. And what they essentially do is they declare the Alien and Sedition Acts to be null and void. This process is going to be referred to as nullification. Let me move this out of the way so you can see all that. All right. So Virginia and Kentucky declared these laws to be null and void, and so they think that they figured out a way to figure out if something's unconstitutional or not. Now we know today that this isn't actually the way you do it, right? The Constitution has a supremacy clause in it. It says very specifically that its laws are supreme to the states' laws, and so states can't just declare things unconstitutional. The court system has to do that. But because Marbury versus Madison is the one that establishes it, that's the Supreme Court case that establishes that power. It's called judicial review. This is the argument that states are going to make. It's important that we understand this argument because this is going to be how later the South will justify leaving the Union over the issue of slavery. It's the same argument that the states ratified the Constitution. If the states don't like what the federal government does, the states have the authority to step in, right? Which after the Civil War, we have completely said, nope, doesn't work that way. So, this idea of nullification ends up being just as controversial and just as impactful later on down the road as the Alien and Sedition Acts were. So, there you go. The Alien and Sedition Acts, they're on the books. The states are saying that some states are saying, well, we're not going to enforce them. It really isn't going to be over until after Adams loses his reelection bid to Thomas Jefferson, and then Jefferson's a Republican, and so he's going to get rid of all of those laws. So, as well as that whiskey tax that he didn't like that Washington passed. So the next big controversy that Adams is going to have to deal with is going to be Prosser's Rebellion. And it's not that the Adams administration deals with it. It just happens during the Adams administration. Gabriel Prosser is a slave in the South. And he is in a unique position as a slave. So in the early days of slavery, each kind of state made its own rules for how to deal with slaves, right? And what the slave codes were, what the slaves could do. And so early on, it was really kind of left up to the slave owner to decide how to treat their slaves. And so they could, if you wanted to educate your slave, you could. If you wanted to give your slave the freedom to go visit a neighbor's plantation, you could. Because a lot of times slave owners would, sell off family members and break them apart. And, some slave owners would, allow a slave to go visit their family over a neighboring plantation if they worked hard. They'd use it as a reward system. And some slave owners, decided that what they would do is they would train some of their slaves as skilled labor. Now, most slaves were unskilled labor. They ended up being, working out in the field. Most of them, that's what they did. They were uneducated. They weren't taught how to read or write. In the beginning, there was a little bit more teaching them how to read or write because slave owners wanted to convert them to Christianity because they thought that was like doing God's work, which is right crazy. Having a slave and think you're doing God's work, but we'll talk about that in a later lecture. So most slaves were unskilled labor. Some slaves were domestic labor. Few, mostly the girls and the lighter skinned girls, were domestic labor. And then an even smaller portion ended up being skilled workers, like a cord twiner or a blacksmith. Gabriel Prosser was a blacksmith, and that put him in a very unique position because he had a skill, right? He worked with metal, making horseshoes or tools on his plantation, but his slave owner also recognized that there was an opportunity when he wasn't doing work on the home plantation that he could rent out Prosser to other local plantations, and then they would pay to have Prosser come and work for them for a day, and then the slave owner would make that money, not Prosser. And so the slave owner essentially trusted Prosser to, hey, I've rented you off to the Smith plantation. You need to walk there this morning. You're going to work for them for 12 hours and then walk back tonight and bring me the money. Right. Now, many of you just said, why would Prosser do that? If you're trusting me to walk on my own to another plantation, I'm going to get a handful of money and walk back to being a slave. You're crazy. We got to remember, slavery, there's a system of oppression there, where one, particularly if you're in the deep South, running is just almost impossible. Particularly in the beginning when the Underground Railroad wasn't as established. You got to travel hundreds of miles through the Deep South. The entire system is set up against you. But even if you're willing to take that risk for yourself, a lot of times if you ran, the slave owner wouldn't just punish you, they'd punish your family, your wife, your children, and even though slaves weren't legally allowed to get married, slave owners promoted relationships between slaves for two big reasons. One, if that relationship resulted in a child, the slave owner got a free slave. And two, the more people you love, the more leverage the slave owner has to get you to do what he wants, right? By punishing the person you love. So slaves were allowed to leave. Prosser left, he came back. But while he was doing that, he was making connections, social networking, essentially, before social media. And he would go and he would talk to these other slaves, and, he was able to kind of organize them. And so he starts to organize these slaves, and he comes up with this plan to take over Richmond, Virginia, the capital of Virginia. And he thinks that if he can organize these slaves and they all rise up and they take the capital, he thinks that poor whites will rise up and help him. And he thinks that very specifically because it makes logical sense. Slavery isn't just hurting slaves, it's hurting slaves the most. But it is also hurting poor whites, because if you're not a in the South, slave owners owned almost all the land. And so if you weren't that 1% in the South that actually owned significant slaves, or that 10% at the top that owned maybe one or two slaves, you were pretty much poor. And you couldn't find work because the slaves were doing all that work for free. And so there is no doubt about it. 90% of the South is dirt poor, and slavery is keeping them dirt poor. And Prosser knew it. And so he thinks, okay, we got a chance to overthrow the system. And so he thinks that if he rises up, takes over Richmond, the poor whites will rise up, and that will end slavery in Virginia forever. Prosser's two things are going to happen here that are going to doom this rebellion. There's over 200 slave rebellions in the South. None of them will be successful. So two things are going to doom them. One, poor whites will not rise up, even though it's in their best interest. And they won't rise up because there's one thing that's more important to them than economics, and that's social status. And as long as Black people are kept in slavery, it doesn't matter how poor white people are, they can say at least they're not slaves. And so it gives them social status that they don't want to relinquish. The second thing that's going to doom the rebellion, and this is probably the most important for Prosser personally, is that one of the slaves that is helping him organize this will tell their slave owner about the rebellion. Almost all slave rebellions get put down this way. Somebody from the inside snitches. All of a sudden, I'm sure all of you guys are like, oh, why would you ever do that? Well, it goes back to that thing we were talking about before. How do you control slaves? Well, you control them by controlling the people that they love. And so essentially what happens is if there's one of these rebellions and you get caught up in the rebellion, they don't just kill you. They'll certainly kill you for rebelling, but then they're also going to punish the people that you love, your wife and your children and whatnot. And so you might be brave and be willing to risk your life, but are you willing to risk the lives of the people that you love? And that's why slavery is so ridiculously oppressive, right? And so one of these slaves that's involved tells, and they're able to squash the rebellion, and the leaders are going to be killed. Ultimately, this will not only fail, but it is going to be a net negative for African American slaves in the South, because the slave codes, these rules regarding slaves, are going to get much more strict. They're going to start to outlaw educating slaves. And so if you're a slave owner and you've taught your slaves to read because you want them to read the Bible, that will be outlawed. Because if you can read and write, then that means you can pass notes and organize, and that makes rebellions easier. Travel restrictions will be put in place where slaves can't travel on their own without an overseer, to make sure that these rebellions don't happen. The South is terrified of these rebellions because some of these southern states, like Mississippi and South Carolina, there are more black people than white people. They can't have rebellions because the numbers don't favor the slave owners. So what we see is, the South gets more restrictive to slaves, and slavery is still going to be this national issue that it will be all the way up until the Civil War. All right. That will lead us to the election of 1800. Adams is having a hard time, right? The Alien and Sedition Acts have made him very unpopular. He's dealing with Prosper's Rebellion, the higher taxes. And so people are upset, and they're upset because they feel like their liberties are being trampled on. And so Jefferson is going to step up and run against Adams, and he's going to run as a Republican, as a Democratic Republican. He's really going to run on this platform of limited federal government, a larger role for the states that are more democratic, and personal liberty, more freedoms. He's going to promise to get rid of the whiskey tax, right, that had caused rebellions earlier. He's going to promise to get rid of the Alien and Sedition Acts, and allow there to be more freedom. And so this election is going to be really nasty. Adams and Jefferson, who will eventually make up and become friends, they're going to be very embittered. Jefferson is, going to call Adams a king and a wannabe tyrant. Adams people, they're all working through surrogates here. So but Adams people are going to bring up his relationship with Sally Hemings. Jefferson is, by all indications, sleeping with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings, which has some real serious implications there. Race implications, but also rape implications. Can a slave give consent? No. And so, all this kind of is getting aired out. And this is one of the nastiest political races in all of American history. We think politics is dirty now. This was a real dirty political campaign. And so plays out, and Jefferson ends up winning. He wins because he promises more local control, more liberty, lower taxes, right? And the people are going to buy that. And so one very important thing that happens here, and it's important because it sets a precedent, right? And that precedent is the peaceful transfer of power. The Federalists have been in charge since 1789. Right. And so with Washington, even though he says he's not a Federalist, he's a Federalist. And then Adams takes over, and the Federalists are still in charge. And so we've never had a non-Federalist president at this point. And so what's going to happen? Well, in a lot of times throughout history where there's baby democracies, the first time the party in power loses, what they do is they just form a coup, right? And they just refuse to give up power. Well, what Adams does is he steps down peacefully. And this is the first time we see this peaceful transfer of power in American history. And that sets the precedent that if you lose, you just leave. Right. And, that's happened ever since. And think about how beautiful that is. Right. When Barack Obama became was elected and George Bush left office, nobody ever thought George Bush would just refuse to leave. When Barack Obama served his 2 terms and President Trump got elected, I mean, you couldn't have 2 different political ideologues, Barack Obama and Donald Trump. Nobody thought Barack Obama would stage a coup and not give up power. No, he peacefully handed it to Trump and he said, this is what the country voted for. This is what they're going to get. And I'll see you again in 4 years. And so it's Adams who peacefully gives up power that sets that precedent. So even though all these kind of bad things happened during the Adams administration, and although he's a founding father and his work during the Revolution is critical to American success, his administration is generally considered not to be very successful, but it's worth it. Because at the end, he peacefully gives up power, and that ends up being his presidential legacy. And so this sets up for a peaceful democracy for the future. All right. So that will conclude our lecture for the day. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it, and I will see you again shortly.